Welcome to the House of Jesus. House of Jesus communities are those that are constantly aligning themselves to Jesus, the cornerstone. Accordingly, they preach and teach the words of Jesus, and they walk out his ways. The vision of this video series is to unpack Jesus' culture of godly love and equipping-based empowerment. As we do so, we will detail the biblical foundation for our convictions, as well as provide practical strategies for implementing the Master's ways. But be assured, walking out Jesus' ways is not a decision, but a lifelong calling and process. We are humbled that you are joining us on this quest. This third video is entitled Jesus' Culture of Equipping-Based Empowerment and has been recorded in partnership with Drew Stedman, a church planting catalyst. This teaching unpacks Paul's understanding of Jesus' commitment to equipping-based empowerment. Beyond Ephesians 4, we see also this reality throughout the Gospels as well as the upper room in Acts 1. My hope is that the listener will learn that equipping is an essential part of kingdom culture, focused on restoring training disciples, and best catalyzed by repetitive clarity. My prayer is that this resource accelerates your alignment to Jesus' ways. As a reminder, we've been really focusing on Paul's understanding of kingdom culture using Ephesians 4. And he pounds the table strongly in that chapter in regards to what it looks like to love one another in a godly way. But Ephesians 11 through 16 really begins to unpack, which is our focus for today, of what I call equipping-based empowerment. Obviously, the intent is to mobilize people into ministry, but there's a very clear instruction and teaching on the need to invest in people. So this all flows out of Paul's understanding. He's used the term oikonomia in chapter 3, which is, I define it as oversight of the house. It's the way that term is literally translated. So that's what we're working on today. Obviously, when you do both of those things, Drew, it's really what we've been talking about over and over again in our conversations, is there's such a link between parenting kids and parenting disciples. We obviously have to love the people that we're investing in, but we have to be very intentional about equipping before we empower. So obviously I've done that with 3 boys. You're in the middle of it with 4 kids. This is very fresh for you on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I think you absolutely hit the point here, because it is, on the one hand, it's the culture we create in the home. There has to be love, there has to be grace, there has to be healthy dialogue and conversation. And I think what's hard, and I think the same thing that can be difficult with church or with staff or whatever group you're a part of, is those don't always fit in the neat linear process we want them to. I found with my kids, a lot of times the significant conversations are at inconvenient times, or at it's in the middle of something hard, actually becomes one of the best conversations that help us. So it's this culture, these relationships, and we're constantly tending to them. And it's nonlinear, and it's not always how I thought I'd draw it up. But as long as we stay with it, over time, you realize there is a culture that's been created that does become so healthy. And that becomes the soil then for so much else, for people that you've done that with. It's such a joy to be able to equip them and then ultimately to empower them. But if you skip one of those steps, so if you don't have the right culture and alignment, or if you haven't actually taken the time to provide the right equipping, then any empowerment is always going to fail. And, I think we've seen that, we've experienced that so many times that it's really become a passion, because at the end of the day, we want people to make it and be able to walk in the fullness of who God has called them to be.
It's good. And just like we were discussing, nobody is a perfect parent. No one always does it correctly with their kids. So grace is an essential part of just taking positive steps every day. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. And Paul kind of jumps into it in the middle of chapter 4. We've already heard from him in regards to godly relationships. And now he adds to that revelation, the need for us to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Verse 11 and 12. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. This is fresh revelation. There's nothing that I can think of in the New Testament that even comes close to creating the clarity that he has right here for how those 5 spiritual gifts express themselves within the body of Christ. And this word gave is important, not only the term itself, but the tense of that specific word conveys the notion that apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers are a team. In no way is Paul, in my mind, expressing, okay, prophets can do this by themselves, teachers can do this by themselves, that there's a team sport here. And Drew, it ties right into what you've said so many times, that the job of a senior pastor is impossible. In other words, if you're an apostle, it's impossible. If you're a prophet, it's impossible. If you're a teacher primarily, it's impossible. It really is a team sport.
Yeah, I think if you go to 1 Corinthians 12 and Paul develops this metaphor of a body, and if you're all eyes, you're all arms, you're all noses, you cease to be a body at that point. But it's actually the distinction within the body, and everyone's connected to the head. So that goes back to our first slide, alignment with Jesus by the Spirit. Then the distinctions come together, and that enables us to do what God's called us to do. But if we try to reduce the body to one function of the body, we cease to actually be who God's called us to be. And I think that's such an important point if we want to ultimately have the ministry that God's given us to do.
That's good. And I'd love for you to unpack this word equip. I find that people don't always grasp and understand what it means. And I don't think I fully understood it until I understood the Greek term. Take us into that.
Yeah, I've learned so much about this from you, Charlie, and looking at this term of some of its context of either restoring a house back to mint condition, so taking something that's been broken down a little bit and restoring it, aligning a broken bone, which is interesting, or training an athlete. So this term's really broad if you look at its actual usage. And I think we can take that, and where I've seen us take the term equip, we reduce it to stuff that's really not the same thing. So I've seen in a lot of ministry, I don't know that anyone would articulate this, but equip and delegate or equip and empowerment become synonyms, which those are not the case at all. So let's go back. I've used my kids making breakfast as a metaphor on previous ones at these trainings, and that we make oatmeal. So that involves fire, that involves all kinds of stuff. What would be totally irresponsible for me to do would be to tell them to go make oatmeal without ever actually taking the time to equip them, providing oversight, clarity of expectations. So many different things that go into doing that well. And so if I just delegate or empower without equipping, I'm setting them up in that case into something dangerous. And I think I would imagine just about anybody here has had an experience in life or probably in ministry where somebody either empowered or delegated something to you, but didn't equip you.
Yes.
And that can be dangerous depending on what the case may be, if it's something that has high stakes. Or it could also be something that ultimately just isn't what it could have been otherwise. And I think a good example would be if you are leading a ministry and you invite somebody from the ministry who you're developing and ask them to preach, and you don't give them any equipping. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, and it could be something really extreme. There could just be, I remember my first sermon, I don't think anybody gave me expectations, and I went an hour and 20 minutes or something like that, and so I look back and I'm grateful for the opportunity, but probably both myself and everybody listening would have been blessed with some expectations. And then, so much of what we're going to talk about later, as far as accountability goes or things like that, if you don't have clear expectations, it's almost impossible to do the rest. So equipping is taking the time, it's slowing down, it's recognizing that it's more than just giving somebody a responsibility or telling them to go do something, but it's a thoughtful process that takes intentionality. And it's going to have to be getting in there with somebody, and it's a bit customized. I don't think there's a one size fits all solution to equipping. More than anything, it's an intentional mindset that you have to have. And I'll say this, I have found for me to do this well is a significant amount of investment on the front end that I have to be prepared to make up, like right from the get-go. I can't casually say, I'm going to equip people. It's a choice that has to be made, that the kingdom purpose of this is worth the time it will take to do it well, so that we're multiplying ultimately laborers for God's harvest field and workers in the body. And so I have to choose to do that up front, and going back to my example of my kids' breakfast or equipping somebody to preach, it's a lot easier. And if you're busy, it's a lot easier to say, can you do this for me? And maybe, send somebody a voice memo with a few thoughts than it is to intentionally sit down with them, using the preaching example, and look at the outline together, give them some of my expectations going into it. If I'm really killing it, have them share with me all the stuff that they're going to do. It's a different ball game, and we'll teach you some of those techniques that are much, much broader than what I've just shared. But my point is that it does take time, and that's something that I have to see as valuable and worth it for the sake, in the end of the day, of multiplying the kingdom.
Yeah, well, Jesus did. He was very intentional. He absolutely took time. The upper room is proof of his investment. We'll be talking a lot about equipping, so this is just an introduction, but it is a rich term with a lot of different restorative transformation of skill and passion. So really excited to dig into that. Paul interestingly unpacks in the next few verses the benefits of equipping, and those are worth looking at real quickly. Unity of the faith, meaning as you equip a group of individuals, they come together having a common understanding of the faith and what it means to follow Jesus. A knowledge of Jesus, obviously, that's an essential part of the equipping process for leadership. Maturity and fullness in Christ, that is obviously what's going to happen over time, and really speaks to the need for you to do it over and over again, and to be patient. It takes a while, depending on who you're investing in. Stability is an interesting one, specifically, you're not tossed back and forth by every wind of teaching. Boy, we see that a lot in our world today. So stability is a great payback for the time that you invest in equipping people. Authenticity, helping people learn to speak the truth in love. Obviously, people are going to be offended. Things are going to be said and done, which are difficult. Forgiveness is needed, but you also have to learn how to be authentic in your relationships with other people. So that's super important. Really, the bottom line ultimately is the priesthood of all believers. It's actually the one thing in the Reformation that really has never been accomplished. It is hard. And so, but it's essential and important for us to think about how we can mobilize everyone in our congregations into ministry. Drew, one of the things that, COVID is obviously a unexpected and completely unique experience for me. But it seems to me that COVID has exposed some of the way in which we haven't equipped people good enough in advance of it. And so talk about problems with stability, problems with, unity of the faith, authenticity. COVID has really, to me, identified a need for us to double down on our emphasis in equipping in the local church.
Yeah, and I think it's that call to discipleship. Ultimately, really, this is an outgrowth of that. We are growing as disciples of Jesus in the ways of Jesus, the culture of Jesus, and then we're learning to take what he's given us and use those things to serve the body. And it's all part of that one flow. And so that brings us to this conclusion that equipping-based empowerment is an essential part of a kingdom culture. And there's a shift that we need to be able to make here, that my responsibility is not just to be a doer, but my responsibility, especially if I have a leadership role in the church, is to be an equipper. And that's the way that we have to see ourselves. And if you have a hard time with that, I want to go back, actually, Charlie, to something that you said, the example of Jesus. And that's really his lifestyle and priority. And I've thought about this a lot. If you think of how Jesus spent his 3 years of earthly ministry, it's really telling. I just reflected on that. And I thought, if there was ever someone who could preach a good sermon, it's Jesus, who is the Word of God incarnate. You're not going to outdo him in your sermon prep. And if he felt that the best way for him to use his time was primarily investing in this group of 120 and this ultimately 70, 12 and 3, and really pouring into them and creating culture. And it's so, I think my brain wants stuff to be reduced to a clear process or something linear. And I don't see that. I see in his life, what I see is he lived life with them and invested a lot in them, took risks on them. And a lot of the principles that we're going to be unpacking over the coming months, I think if you grid that through, how did Jesus interact with his disciples? And you mentioned that a lot, Charlie. The group that would later become the upper room, it's what were the 3 years prior to that that enabled there to be an upper room? And that was Jesus taking the time to equip, and ultimately that freed him to then empower. And so, I look at that and I think if that's what Jesus thought was the most important, to be an equipper and a discipler, who am I to think that I'm so busy or my ministry, needs me to be doing so much that I don't have the time to do that? I think all of us hopefully would acknowledge that if that's the way of Jesus, then we need to follow in his footsteps. And it doesn't mean we don't use our gifts in our other areas. It doesn't mean there's not appropriate places to be a doer, but we need to see ourselves ultimately as equippers so that we can multiply the ministry beyond our capacity or our gifting. So with equipping-based empowerment, this term we're using, ultimately it's focused on restoring and training disciples to use their spiritual gifts and talents to serve others. And I'd say both of those words are important. There is an element here of restorative work where we're helping people. Ultimately, we live in a world tainted by sin and all kinds of stuff, whether it's somebody's fault, the church's fault, their fault, my fault, who knows? But there's that component of it that is pastoral, that's disciple making. But then there's this other side that's training, and we're taking the time to help people grow into what they're called to do. And I really think that last little part is significant, that the goal of this is to empower people to serve. And that's what we're working on. We want to help people not develop their spiritual gifts so they can feel better about themselves, but recognizing these, as you said, Charlie, have been given by Christ for the sake of a mature body. And so we want to steward that well, so that we ultimately can see a mature church.
That's good. And that, again, it goes without saying that restoration and training takes time. And that's part of the challenge, is to be patient. And we'll be talking much more about that. And like last time, in terms of relationships, we want to emphasize again that equipping-based empowerment is best catalyzed by repetitive clarity. In other words, if you're wanting your upper room to understand how to equip and empower disciples, you need to gear up for a repetitive process. And they need clarity in terms of your example, incarnational. They need to hear it, auditory, and they need to read it visually. All of those things play a really important part in continuing to remind people of what's important. And Drew, I ran across with Moses these days, and in Deuteronomy 6, he talks about repetitive clarity. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk on the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. So I think Moses gets it. I think he understands this slide and the importance of not being intuitive, which is the point we've been trying to make, Drew.
Yeah, maybe Moses could be our tutor on this one, but that is so significant. And I think if you look and see something that struck me about the Jewish faith is they've been minorities almost always. And it is that repetitive clarity of identity has been so crucial. And I think that's something for us as believers, especially in this season, that's going to be such a big deal for us as well. We have to be clear. There's this preaching antidote that if it's a mist in the pulpit, it's a fog in the pew. And what it's speaking to, if you are saying something and you're not crystal clear about what you're trying to say, then the people that you're preaching to will interpret that and they won't have a clue what you're trying to say. And so you have to work really hard. And I've found as a preacher, getting from a mist where I'm mostly clear to actually being fully clear, that's a lot of the hard work, is getting to that point of clarity. And then I have to drive that in over and over again. And ultimately, that's what enables somebody to hear what I'm trying to communicate to them. And so I think all the more so when it comes to this and leadership, our joke when I'm talking to preachers often is that people go to lunch afterwards, and by the time they're done with the lunch, they've already had enough life happen to them. They probably forgot what you tried to say. And so that's true in all areas. That's the vision of your church. That's the org chart you just rolled out. That's someone's role description. I mean, all of it we have so much coming at us consistently. Life changes. And I can so easily fall into the temptation or the trap that because I sent an email out a year ago, or I at staff meeting got up one time and said, this is what we're doing, that everybody's got it. And I found that way of thinking will always fail me in the end. And there's this quote we've used quite a few times over the last couple of years, Charlie, that intuition is rarely scalable. And, I'm stereotyping a little bit, but I would say in my experience, pastors tend to be on the intuitive side of personality types. And there are plenty that aren't. And so don't be insecure if that's you. There are great examples of ones who are not. But if I had to, pick an average, I would say the average is going to lean more intuitively. And that's a great asset in pastoral care and in preaching in a lot of different areas. But an area where that becomes really difficult is it's hard to scale your intuition. And most people, they just aren't going to think like you intuitively think. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's a thing. It's one of those things in life. It is what it is. And so if the system is built around getting people to think like you, then you will always be frustrated because your vision will have a limit, and the vision that God's put on your church will have a limit. But if instead you can, as a team, uncover the intuition and really determine what of this is critical, what of this intuition needs to be codified in some way. And as Moses reminded us, we need to put it on our hands and, on all of our emails. And maybe we could come up with a modern example of this. Our social media accounts, every Sunday service, at the beginning of every life group, at the beginning of every staff meeting, visually depicted on our church building walls. And I've seen churches that do such a good job of this. Mm-hmm. And, what are those things that maybe started with intuition, but ultimately need to be uncovered? The team needs to speak into it. People with other gifts need to weigh in on the intuition. But gets to that point of clarity. And that becomes such a big deal so that we can steward what God has actually given us. And actually, Charlie, what I would love is if you could take us, I've so resonated when I first saw this. You've put this into a process that I think is really easy to wrap our heads around. It obviously has a lot to it, and it's going to take time to flesh it out. But I think even for our purposes today, you could walk us through the roadmap of what are the key steps so that we can do these competencies well.
So the first picture is just a summary of everything that's a part of this model. The relational values represents the values we've been talking about in regards to loving one another well. The equipping values is the clarity fit apprenticing, coaching, and transition steps. So let's look at each of those 5 very quickly. In my mind, these are things that Jesus and the Father model for us, and we will talk more about that. But clarity is essentially vision. It is starting with the win in mind. And I see the Father doing that with a very clear Revelation 21 vision that he had even before the creation of the world. He selects Jesus as the sacrifice before the world is created. And so he's got clarity from the get-go, and he uses that clarity to design the process and to guide the process, guide history, literally. The second step is anointed fit, which is getting the right people in the right roles. Obviously, once he knows the direction and what his mission and vision is, he needs to find the right individuals who love him well, are obedient, have the right heart, have the right skills and giftings. And we see that over and over in the Old and New Testament. Patient apprenticing, he's very patient, is the process of helping those individuals, Moses, Abraham, on and on, to allow them to become insiders. Making outsiders insiders is that apprenticing process. And we'll break down all of these based on the drivers that you can see. The next step is coaching. Once these individuals are up and running in their ministry, there's a need to continue to invest in them. That's really what I've been studying in regards to Moses, because obviously we don't really see the 60 plus years of apprenticing, but once he is called and once he's activated into leadership, then there is an immense amount of coaching and support that the Father is providing him. And so putting more into servants than you take out is not just something we should do. The Father and Jesus model that very effectively. Honoring transition is the inevitable last step in the equipping process, because either we are going to transition into a new calling, or we're going to fail, or we're going to die. So It's a matter of time before a transition is made. We need to know how to do that. It's really different to transition someone who has struggled and failed and is not a good fit versus transitioning someone who's been highly successful. But that's what it's about, helping disciples to take their next right step of faith. So these are 5 things that I've identified that I think are values for the Father in Jesus. We'll walk through those. And in the process of walking through those, we obviously will be talking about leading a vision, developing leaders, and leading a team.
Every word on that is something that we're going to unpack. And so these concepts are the high level overview, and then we'll dive into this. But our hope would be that by the end of this whole series, that you feel empowered and equipped to do these things and walk through this process ultimately so that we can do our part in releasing people into the purposes of God.